Close your eyes now, and let yourself settle into comfort. Tonight, we begin a journey through the most peaceful of mysteries, the question that has whispered through human consciousness since the first moment someone gazed up at the stars and wondered, what is reality? It's a question so vast, so encompassing, that it seems to dissolve the harder you look at it. And perhaps that's exactly right. Perhaps that's where the beauty lives. Imagine, if you will, the first philosophers, sitting in the warm Mediterranean evening, watching shadows lengthen across stone courtyards. They ask themselves, what truly exists? Not just the things we can touch and see, but existence itself. What is the nature of the world beneath our perceptions? This realm of inquiry came to be called metaphysics, a word that simply means after physics or beyond physics. It's the study of reality at its most fundamental level. Not the physics of atoms and forces, but something even deeper. The questions that come before science can begin. What is causation? What is time? What is space? What does it mean for something to be possible? These questions emerged slowly, organically, from the wonder of being alive and aware. And eventually, they were gathered together by a man we now call Aristotle, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, in texts that would later be collected under the title Metaphysics. Aristotle didn't set out to create a new field of study. He was simply trying to understand the world. He asked, what are the first principles? What are the ultimate causes of things? His work became a foundation, a starting point for thousands of years of contemplation. Centuries later, in the medieval halls of European monasteries, scholars like Thomas Aquinas would take up these questions again. In his massive work, the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas wove together Aristotelian philosophy with theological reflection, asking, how does God relate to being? What is the nature of existence itself? His writings moved slowly, methodically, like a river carving through stone. Question after question, objection after objection, reply after reply. Even if you don't follow every argument, there's something deeply restful about his systematic approach, like watching a master craftsman at work. Then came the early modern period, and with it, René Descartes, sitting alone by a fire in a small room, doubting everything he thought he knew. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes asked, what can I be absolutely certain of? He stripped away assumption after assumption, until he arrived at that famous conclusion, I think, therefore I am. Even in radical doubt, he found one unshakable truth, the reality of his own thinking existence. From this single point of certainty, he tried to rebuild the world. The questions kept evolving. In the 18th century, Immanuel Kant wrote his monumental critique of pure reason, exploring how our minds structure our experience of reality. He argued that we never perceive reality as it is in itself. We only experience reality as it appears to us, filtered through the categories of our understanding. Space and time, he suggested, are not features of reality itself, but frameworks that our minds impose on experience. It's a dizzying thought, but also strangely comforting. We are not passive receivers of reality. We are active participants in creating the world we experience. And the conversation continues, even into our own time. In 1980, the philosopher Saul Kripke published a slim volume called Naming and Necessity, which revolutionized how we think about possibility and identity. What makes something necessarily true versus merely accidentally true? Could you have been born at a different time and still be you? These questions ripple outward into countless others. But within metaphysics lives a more specific inquiry, something called ontology. If metaphysics asks, what is reality? Ontology asks, what kinds of things exist within that reality? The ancient Greeks were fascinated by this. Parmenides argued that change and multiplicity are illusions, that only one eternal, unchanging being truly exists. His student, or perhaps his rival, Plato, developed a different view. In his dialogues, the Parmenides, the Republic, Plato suggested that the physical things we see around us are merely shadows or copies of perfect, eternal forms. Somewhere beyond this world of change and decay exists the perfect form of justice, the perfect form of beauty, the perfect circle, the perfect triangle. The things we encounter in daily life are just imperfect reflections of these eternal truths. Aristotle, Plato's student, couldn't quite accept this. He argued that forms don't exist in some separate realm. They exist in the things themselves. A horse's hoarseness isn't located in a perfect heaven somewhere. It's right there, embodied in the actual horse. In his work, The Categories, Aristotle laid out different kinds of being: substances, qualities, quantities, relations. He created a taxonomy of existence itself. These questions echoed through the centuries. In the medieval period, scholars debated whether universals, general categories like redness or humanity, really exist, or whether they're just convenient labels we apply to individual things. Are they real or just names? This debate between realism and nominalism consumed some of the finest minds of the age, and in a way, it still hasn't been fully resolved. In the 20th century, the philosopher W.V.O. Quine wrote an elegant essay called On What There Is. He asked a deceptively simple question: what is our criterion for saying something exists? His answer: if we need to refer to something in our best scientific theories, then we should accept that it exists. Numbers exist because we need them for physics. Sets exist because we need them for mathematics. It's a pragmatic, almost austere approach to ontology, but there's something appealing about its clarity. And then there's David Lewis, who pushed the boundaries of possibility itself. In his book on the plurality of worlds, Lewis argued, quite seriously, that every possible world actually exists somewhere, just as real as our own world. Every choice not made, every path not taken, plays out in its own concrete reality. It's an idea that staggers the imagination. Infinite worlds, infinite possibilities, all equally real. But you don't need to solve these questions tonight. You don't need to choose between Plato and Aristotle, between Descartes and Kant. These ideas are here simply to remind you of something profound: that reality is stranger, deeper, and more mysterious than we usually remember in our daily lives. The questions remain open. The wonder remains. And in that openness, in that vast, gentle uncertainty, there's a kind of peace. Reality is large enough to hold all our questions, all our theories, all our dreams. So rest now, and let these thoughts drift through your mind like clouds across an evening sky. The mystery of what is real will still be here tomorrow, patient, eternal, waiting for the next curious mind to wonder. What is reality? And the universe, in its infinite kindness, simply smiles and does not answer. And now, a quieter question emerges from the shadows. If we've asked what reality is, we must now turn inward and ask something perhaps even more unsettling. How can we know anything about it? This is where doubt enters. Not the anxious doubt of everyday worry, but something more profound, a philosophical doubt that sits at the very foundation of thought itself. And strangely, there's something peaceful in this doubt, something honest, because it asks us to look carefully at what we claim to know, and to hold it gently, with humility. This realm of inquiry is called epistemology, from the Greek words episteme, meaning knowledge, and logos, meaning study. It is the study of knowledge itself. What is knowledge? How does it differ from mere belief or opinion? When are we justified in saying we know something rather than simply think it or hope it? The ancient Greeks contemplated these questions deeply. Plato, in his dialogue called the Theaetetus, explored what knowledge might be. Is it simply perception? No, because our senses deceive us. Is it true belief? No, because we might believe something true by accident, without really understanding why it's true. Perhaps, Plato suggested, knowledge is justified true belief. A belief that is not only true, but that we have good reasons for holding. For over 2,000 years, this definition seemed satisfactory. Knowledge was justified true belief. 3 simple conditions. But then, in 1963, a philosopher named Edmund Gettier published a short paper, just 3 pages, that would shake the entire field. He showed, through clever examples, that you could have justified true belief without having knowledge. You could meet all 3 conditions and still, somehow, not really know. It was a puzzle that remains unsolved to this day, a gentle reminder that even our most basic concepts resist easy definition. But before we can ask what knowledge is, perhaps we should ask an even more fundamental question. Can we know anything at all? This is the domain of skepticism. Not skepticism in the casual sense of being doubtful or cynical, but philosophical skepticism, which questions whether genuine knowledge is even possible. It's a position that has haunted philosophy since ancient times. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, a philosopher named Sextus Empiricus compiled a work called Outlines of Pyrrhonism, documenting the arguments of the ancient skeptics. They noticed something troubling. For every argument supporting a belief, an equally strong argument could be made against it. For every reason to think the world is one way, there seemed to be an equally good reason to think it's another way. Their solution? Suspend judgment entirely. Stop claiming to know. Simply observe, simply experience, and let go of the need for certainty. And in that letting go, they claimed, one finds a kind of peace, ataraxia, they called it. Tranquility. Centuries later, skeptical arguments were revived by René Descartes, though for a different purpose. In his meditations, particularly the famous First Meditation, Descartes decided to doubt everything. He imagined that an evil demon might be deceiving him about everything he perceives. Maybe the entire world is an illusion. Maybe mathematics itself is a trick. Maybe he's dreaming right now. It's dizzying. But Descartes was using skepticism as a tool, trying to find something so certain that not even the most radical doubt could shake it. And he found it, as we mentioned before, in the simple fact of his own thinking existence. David Hume, writing in 18th century Scotland, pushed skeptical thinking even further. In his Inquirer Concerning Human Understanding, Hume pointed out something deeply unsettling about the way we reason. We assume that the future will resemble the past. We assume that if the sun has risen every day of our lives, it will rise tomorrow. But what justifies this assumption? Only the fact that the future has resembled the past, so far. But that's circular reasoning. We're using the very principle we're trying to justify. Hume called this the problem of induction, and it remains one of the most challenging puzzles in philosophy. Every scientific prediction, every plan we make, rests on this unjustified assumption. And yet, we have no choice but to proceed as if it's true. The contemporary philosopher Barry Stroud has continued to explore these skeptical arguments, showing how they continue to challenge our confidence in even the most basic claims about the external world. But skepticism, for all its power, leaves us in a strange place. We cannot live as skeptics. We must act, must believe, must carry on, even if we cannot fully justify our beliefs. So how have philosophers tried to answer the skeptic? How have they tried to secure knowledge on firm ground? One approach is called rationalism. The rationalists believed that reason alone, pure thought, independent of sensory experience, could give us certain knowledge. They looked to mathematics as their model. When you prove a theorem in geometry, you're not relying on observation. You're following logical necessity. 2 + 2 = 4. Not because we've observed it many times, but because it simply must be true. The rationalists thought this kind of certainty could extend beyond mathematics into metaphysics and even physics. René Descartes was perhaps the most famous rationalist. After his radical doubt, he rebuilt knowledge using reason as his primary tool. From "I think, therefore I am," he tried to prove God's existence. And from God's existence, he tried to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct ideas. Whether or not his arguments succeed, there's something admirable about the attempt. This faith in human reason as a path to truth. Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch lens-grinder and philosopher, took rationalism even further. His masterwork, The Ethics, is written in geometrical form. Definitions, axioms, propositions, proofs, like Euclid's Elements, but applied to the nature of God, mind, and emotion. Spinoza believed that everything follows from the nature of God, or nature, with logical necessity. To understand reality is to understand this necessity, to see how everything fits together in one vast interconnected system. There's something almost mystical about Spinoza's vision, a rational mysticism, if such a thing is possible. And then there's Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who believed that this world, despite all its apparent imperfections, is the best of all possible worlds. In his monadology, Leibniz described reality as composed of simple substances called monads, each one reflecting the entire universe from its own perspective. It's a strange, beautiful vision, reality as an infinite symphony of individual perspectives, all perfectly harmonized by God. But not everyone found reason alone sufficient. Another tradition emerged, particularly in Britain, that placed experience at the center of knowledge. This tradition is called empiricism, and it holds that sensory experience is the primary, perhaps the only, source of genuine knowledge. John Locke, in his essay concerning human understanding, argued that the mind at birth is like a blank slate, tabula rasa, waiting to be written upon by experience. We are not born with innate ideas, Locke claimed. Everything we know comes from sensation and reflection upon sensation. It's a humble vision of knowledge, not born from above, but built up slowly from below, through patient observation and careful thought. George Berkeley took empiricism in a radical direction. In his treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, Berkeley argued that material substance doesn't exist at all. All that exists are minds and ideas. The table you see, the tree outside, the world itself, these are nothing but collections of sensations in the mind. To be is to be perceived. Ses percipi. It sounds absurd, yet Berkeley defended it with remarkable ingenuity. If everything we know comes from experience, and experience is always mental, what grounds do we have for believing in a material world outside the mind? And then David Hume took empiricism to its logical conclusion. In his inquiry, Hume argued that reason is, and ought to be, the slave of the passions. Reason alone cannot motivate us to action. And as we've seen, reason cannot even justify our most basic beliefs about causation and induction. We believe the sun will rise tomorrow, not because reason proves it, but because custom and habit have trained us to expect it. We are creatures of feeling and habit more than creatures of pure reason. So where does this leave us? The rationalists sought certainty in reason. The empiricists sought truth in experience. The skeptics doubted both. And here we are, thousands of years later, still wondering, still asking, still seeking some path through the darkness to understanding. But perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the search itself is what matters. Perhaps knowledge isn't a destination, but a journey, a careful, humble, ongoing conversation between reason and experience, between certainty and doubt, between what we hope is true and what we can honestly claim to know. You don't need to solve these puzzles tonight. You don't need to choose between Descartes and Hume, between rationalism and empiricism. These questions are here simply to remind you that knowing is harder than it seems, and that this difficulty, this challenge, is part of what makes us human. So let your thoughts drift now. Let them float between certainty and uncertainty, between knowledge and mystery. Rest in the space between knowing and not knowing. Rest in the gentle awareness that we are all, each of us, trying to understand, trying to see clearly, trying to find our way. The questions remain. The search continues. And in that endless search, there is a strange kind of comfort. The comfort of knowing that we are not alone in our uncertainty. Every philosopher who ever lived has walked this path before us, has wondered these same questions, has stared into the same beautiful, terrifying mystery. And the mystery, patient and kind, simply waits. How can we know anything at all? Perhaps we cannot. Perhaps we can. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. But for now, rest. Let it be. The questions will still be here tomorrow, waiting with infinite patience for the next curious mind to ask them again. We've asked what reality is. We've wondered how we can know anything about it. And now, before we go any further, we must pause and examine something even more fundamental. The very tools we use to think. The rules of thinking itself. This is the domain of logic, the study of valid reasoning, of correct inference, of how one thought legitimately follows from another. Logic doesn't tell us what to think. It tells us how to think, how to move from one idea to the next without losing truth along the way. In everyday life, we reason constantly without thinking about it. We make inferences, draw conclusions, connect ideas. But sometimes our reasoning goes astray. Sometimes we feel certain we've proven something, only to discover later that our argument had a flaw, a gap, a hidden mistake. Logic is the art of examining our reasoning carefully, of distinguishing good arguments from bad ones, of seeing clearly the invisible structure that connects premises to conclusions. The systematic study of logic begins, as so many things do, with Aristotle. In a collection of works later called the Organon, which simply means instrument or tool, Aristotle laid out the first comprehensive system of logic. At its heart was the syllogism, a form of argument with two premises and a conclusion. Consider this: all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Three simple statements, connected by an invisible chain of necessity. If the first two are true, the third must be true. There's no escape from it. The conclusion follows with the force of inevitability. Aristotle catalogued the valid forms of syllogisms, distinguished them from invalid ones, and showed how complex reasoning could be broken down into these simple, certain steps. For over 2,000 years, Aristotelian logic dominated Western thought. Students memorized the valid forms, learned to detect fallacies, trained their minds in the discipline of rigorous reasoning. Medieval logicians expanded on Aristotle's work, developing sophisticated theories of supposition, consequence, and obligation. In the monasteries and universities of Europe, scholars refined logical theory with extraordinary subtlety, creating distinctions and technical vocabulary that can seem arcane today, but represented genuine advances in understanding how language and reasoning connect. But then, in the 19th century, something remarkable happened. Logic underwent a revolution, so profound that it transformed not just philosophy, but mathematics, and eventually even gave birth to computer science. A German mathematician and philosopher named Gottlob Frege published a small book in 1879 titled Begriffsschrift, concept script. It looked strange, filled with unusual symbols and two-dimensional notation, unlike anything seen before. Frege was trying to do something unprecedented. Create a language so precise, so unambiguous, that every step of mathematical reasoning could be made completely explicit. Frege realized that ordinary language, for all its richness and beauty, is not well suited to rigorous reasoning. Words have multiple meanings. Grammar can be ambiguous. Context matters in subtle ways. So Frege invented a new kind of notation, a logical language that could express the structure of thoughts with perfect clarity. His system went far beyond Aristotelian syllogisms. Frege could express complex relationships, nested quantifiers, functions, and arguments. He could say things like, for every number, there exists a larger number, and represent the logical structure of that statement precisely, breaking it down into its components. Quantifiers, variables, predicates, all fitting together like the gears of a perfect machine. At first, hardly anyone noticed Frege's work. It seemed too technical, too removed from philosophical questions that mattered. But gradually, other thinkers began to see what he had done. Bertrand Russell, a young British philosopher and mathematician, recognized the power of Frege's approach. Russell, along with his colleague Alfred North Whitehead, undertook an extraordinary project to show that all of mathematics could be derived from pure logic. Their work, Principia Mathematica, published in 3 massive volumes starting in 1910, attempted to prove that mathematical truths were really logical truths in disguise. Every theorem of arithmetic, every equation, every mathematical proof, all of it, they hoped, could be reduced to the manipulation of symbols according to logical rules. The symbolism was intimidating. Hundreds of pages of dense notation, leading finally, famously, to the proof that 1 + 1 = 2, a proposition that seems obvious, but that Russell and Whitehead showed could be derived from the most basic logical principles. There's something almost comical about the effort, and yet something profound. They were trying to show that mathematics rests on certainty, on the bedrock of logical necessity. While Russell and Whitehead worked on their monumental project, other mathematicians were exploring the foundations of logic from different angles. David Hilbert, perhaps the greatest mathematician of his era, had a vision to formalize all of mathematics, to reduce it to a finite set of axioms and rules of inference, and to prove that this system was both consistent, free from contradictions, and complete, capable of proving every true mathematical statement. In 1928, Hilbert and Wilhelm Ackermann published Grundzüge der theoretischen Logik, Principles of Theoretical Logic. It was a textbook, a systematic presentation of modern mathematical logic. It laid out formal systems, proof theory, the relationship between syntax and semantics. It showed how logic had become a precise mathematical discipline, no longer merely philosophical speculation, but a rigorous science. Hilbert's program seemed within reach. Mathematics would be placed on absolutely secure foundations. Every question would be, in principle, decidable. We would have at last complete certainty. But then came Kurt Gödel. In 1931, Gödel proved something shocking. Any consistent formal system strong enough to express basic arithmetic must be incomplete. There will always be true statements that cannot be proved within the system. The dream of complete certainty was impossible. Logic itself had limits. And yet, far from diminishing logic, Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed its power. They were proven using logical methods. They showed what logic could and couldn't do. They revealed something profound about the nature of mathematical truth. Modern logic has continued to develop in directions Aristotle could never have imagined. Modal logic explores necessity and possibility. Intuitionistic logic questions the law of excluded middle. Fuzzy logic handles degrees of truth. Temporal logic reasons about time. Quantum logic grapples with the strange world of subatomic particles. But at its core, logic remains what it has always been: the study of consequence, of what follows from what, of the invisible threads that connect truth to truth. When we say, if A, then B, we're making a claim about logical structure, about the relationship between propositions. When we spot a contradiction, we're recognizing that something has gone wrong in our reasoning. When we follow a proof step by step, we're tracing a path through logical space, moving from what we know to what we can discover. Logic doesn't tell us which premises to accept. It doesn't reveal which assumptions are true. Those questions belong to other inquiries, to science, to experience, to metaphysics, to ethics. Logic only tells us, if you accept these premises, then you must accept these conclusions. It maps the territory of implication, of entailment, of logical necessity. And there's something deeply peaceful about logic. In a world of uncertainty, of ambiguity, of endless debate, logic offers a kind of clarity. Not about everything, certainly. Not about what matters most, perhaps. But about the structure of reasoning itself, about how thoughts fit together, about what can be said with precision, and what remains necessarily vague. You don't need to master symbolic notation tonight. You don't need to remember the difference between modus ponens and modus tollens. These technical details aren't what matter as you drift towards sleep. What matters is simply this, that there is an order to thinking, a structure to reasoning, a set of rules that govern how truths connect to one another. And these rules, these laws of logic, are strange things. They're not physical laws, like gravity or electromagnetism. They're not conventional rules, like the rules of chess or etiquette. They seem to exist in some third realm. Not physical, not merely conventional, but necessary. True in every possible world. True regardless of what anyone thinks. When you conclude that if all humans are mortal, and Socrates is human, then Socrates must be mortal. You're not conducting an experiment. You're not taking a vote. You're seeing a necessary connection, as clearly as you see that 2 + 2 = 4. And that seeing, that recognition of logical necessity, is one of the strangest and most wonderful capacities of the human mind. So rest now in the certainty that logic provides. Not certainty about everything. We've already seen how limited our knowledge is, but certainty about the rules of the game, about how reasoning works, about what follows from what. It's a small island of clarity in a vast ocean of mystery. The rules of thinking are patient and eternal. They were true before humans discovered them, and they'll remain true long after we're gone. And tonight, as your thoughts begin to slow and soften and drift, they're still there, still operating, still connecting idea to idea with invisible threads of necessity. If this, then that. If that, then this. A gentle rhythm. A logical dance. The rules of thinking, humming quietly in the background, holding everything together. We've looked outward at reality. We've examined how we know things about the world. We've traced the rules of thought itself. But now we turn inward. We turn to the stranger, more intimate mystery. Not the world out there, but the world in here. The mystery of you. What is this experience you're having right now? This awareness. This consciousness. The feeling of being you, looking out at the world from behind your eyes. Where does it come from? What is it made of? And perhaps most puzzling of all, what makes you the same person you were yesterday, or 10 years ago, or when you were born? These questions belong to the philosophy of mind, the study of consciousness, mental states, thoughts, feelings, and their relationship to the physical world. It is, in many ways, the most personal branch of philosophy, because unlike metaphysics or logic, which study abstract structures outside ourselves, the philosophy of mind studies the very thing that's doing the studying. The mind examining itself. Consciousness, trying to understand consciousness. It's a bit like an eye trying to see itself, or a hand trying to grasp itself. There's something paradoxical about it, something that circles back on itself in dizzying ways. And yet we cannot help but wonder. The puzzle begins, as it so often does, with René Descartes. In his Meditations, Descartes made a sharp distinction between two kinds of substance. There is residential extensor, extended substance, physical matter, which has location, dimension, and occupies space. Your body is extended substance. So is this room, this planet, the stars. Extended substance follows physical laws. It moves according to cause and effect. It can be measured, weighed, observed. But then there is residential cogitans, thinking substance. Mind, consciousness, the thing that doubts, perceives, imagines, feels. And this, Descartes argued, is fundamentally different. Mind has no location. You cannot measure consciousness in inches or pounds. You cannot observe someone else's thoughts directly. Mind is private, immediate, known only to itself. This view is called mind-body dualism. The idea that mind and body are two fundamentally different kinds of things. It matches our intuitive sense of ourselves. You are not just your body. You have a body, certainly, but you, the real you, the experiencing you, seem to be something more. Something that exists beyond the physical. But dualism immediately raises a troubling question. If mind and body are so different, how do they interact? How does a non-physical thought cause your physical arm to move? How does physical light hitting your physical retina create the non-physical experience of seeing red? Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, one of Descartes' most perceptive correspondents, pressed him on exactly this point in a series of letters. If mind has no physical properties, how can it push or pull on matter? Descartes struggled to answer. He suggested that mind and body interact through the pineal gland in the brain. But this only pushed the problem back a step. How does an immaterial mind interact with even a small piece of matter like the pineal gland? The problem has haunted dualism ever since. And in the 20th century, philosophers began to explore alternative views. Gilbert Ryle, in his book The Concept of Mind, published in 1949, launched a devastating critique of what he called the ghost in the machine. Descartes' picture of an immaterial mind inhabiting a physical body. Ryle argued that this whole way of thinking about mind was a category mistake, like asking how much a number weighs or what color Thursday is. Mental terms, Ryle suggested, don't refer to private inner objects but to dispositions, tendencies, patterns of behavior. To say someone is intelligent isn't to describe an invisible mental substance. It's to say they tend to solve problems, to learn quickly, to adapt. Mind isn't a thing at all. It's a way of talking about what bodies do. But this seems to leave something out, doesn't it? Behavior is one thing. But what about the feeling of experience? The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the particular quality of what it's like to be you right now. Listening to these words, perhaps feeling the softness of your pillow, the weight of your blanket? Thomas Nagel captured this perfectly in a famous 1974 paper titled, "What is it like to be a bat?" Nagel pointed out that bats navigate by echolocation, by emitting high-frequency sounds and detecting their echoes. This gives bats a kind of experience utterly alien to us. We can study bat brains, map their neurons, understand the physics of echolocation, but we can never know what it's actually like to be a bat, to experience the world through echolocation. There is a subjective character to experience that resists purely objective description. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. We can imagine explaining how the brain processes information, how neurons fire, how sensory input leads to motor output. That's the easy problem. Easy in principle, if not in practice. But explaining why all this physical processing is accompanied by subjective experience, why there is something it is like to be conscious, that remains deeply mysterious. David Chalmers, in his 1996 book The Conscious Mind, argued that consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical processes alone. No matter how completely we understand the brain, we won't have explained the qualitative feel of experience, what he calls qualia, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain. These seem to be extra facts about the world, facts that go beyond any physical description. And so the mystery deepens. Are we purely physical beings? Our consciousness somehow emerging from the complexity of our brains? Or is consciousness something additional, something that cannot be reduced to neurons and synapses? The debate continues, with no resolution in sight. But there's another puzzle, perhaps even more intimate. Even if we understood what consciousness is, we would still face the question, what makes you you? Think about it. You are not the same physical being you were 10 years ago. Most of the atoms in your body have been replaced. Your cells have died and been replaced. Your body has changed, aged, transformed. And yet, you feel like the same person. You remember being that younger you. You feel a continuity of identity stretching back through time. But what grounds this identity? What makes the person reading these words now the same person who existed in the past and will exist in the future? This is the problem of personal identity, one of the most fascinating puzzles in philosophy. John Locke, in his essay concerning human understanding, proposed a bold answer. Personal identity consists in continuity of consciousness, particularly memory. You are the same person as the child you once were because you remember being that child. You have psychological continuity stretching back through time. It's not your body that makes you you. After all, your body changes constantly. It's your memories, your sense of yourself as a continuing subject of experience. But this raises problems. What about memories you've forgotten? Are you no longer the person who had those experiences? What about false memories? If you misremember something, does that break your identity? And what if, through some strange technology, your memories were transplanted into another body? Would you go with your memories, or stay with your body? David Hume, ever the skeptic, pushed even further. In his treatise of human nature, Hume argued that when he looked inside himself for this thing called self, he could never find it. All he found were particular experiences, sensations, emotions, thoughts, following one after another. But no underlying self that has these experiences. No permanent, unchanging I that remains constant through time. The self, Hume suggested, is nothing but a bundle of perceptions held together by memory and causation, but with no substance beneath. It's a dizzying thought. Are you nothing but a collection of experiences? Is the feeling of being a unified self an illusion? In our own time, Derek Parfit explored these questions with extraordinary rigor in his book Reasons and Persons. Parfit argued that personal identity might not be what matters for survival and for ethics. Through thought experiments involving brain transplants, teleportation, and gradual replacement of neurons, Parfit suggested that what matters isn't whether you're strictly identical to your future self, but whether there's psychological connectedness and continuity. Identity might be a matter of degree, not an all-or-nothing thing. Imagine you step into a teleporter. It scans your body and brain, destroys the original, and creates an exact duplicate on Mars. Is that duplicate you? Has you survived the journey? Or have you died, replaced by a copy? Parfit suggests that these questions might not have determinate answers. Survival might be a matter of degree. The Mars person is continuous with you, psychologically connected to you. And that might be all that matters. It's both unsettling and strangely liberating. If personal identity is less deep than we thought, if the boundaries between self and other are somewhat conventional rather than metaphysically fundamental, then perhaps we should care about others nearly as much as we care about our future selves. Perhaps the divisions between people are less sharp than they seem. But as you lie here now, drifting towards sleep, these abstract puzzles fade into the simple, undeniable fact of your own experience. You are here. You are aware. You are you. The philosophical puzzles don't diminish that. They simply remind you of how strange and wonderful it is to be a conscious being at all. You are a pattern of matter that has somehow become aware of itself. Atoms arranged in such a way that they can think, feel, wonder, dream. Out of purely physical processes, neurons firing, chemicals flowing, emerges this miraculous thing called consciousness. This interior light. This sense of being someone, somewhere, experiencing something. And that consciousness carries with it a sense of continuity, a thread of identity stretching from past to future. You remember yesterday. You anticipate tomorrow. You feel yourself to be one person moving through time, even as everything about you changes. It's a mystery, perhaps the deepest mystery there is. Not what the universe is made of, but what you are made of. Not how matter moves, but how matter becomes mind. Not what exists out there, but what it's like to be in here. And the answer, if there is one, remains just beyond reach. Like a word on the tip of your tongue. Like a dream you can't quite remember. Present and immediate, yet impossible to fully grasp. So rest now in the mystery of your own being. Rest in the simple fact of awareness. You don't need to solve the hard problem of consciousness tonight. You don't need to determine the boundaries of your identity. Just be. Just experience. Just exist in this moment, as this particular pattern of consciousness in the vast cosmos. You are here. You are aware. You are you. And for now, that is enough. We've journeyed through questions of reality, knowledge, logic, and consciousness. But now we must pause and consider something we've been using all along, something so familiar we hardly notice it. Language. Every thought we've explored, every question we've asked, every answer we've considered, all of it has been shaped by words. Language is the medium through which we think, the tool with which we communicate, the lens through which we perceive and describe reality. And yet, what exactly is language? How do words connect to things? How does meaning work? How do sounds or marks on paper manage to refer to the world? These questions belong to the philosophy of language, a field that emerged powerfully in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and transformed the entire landscape of philosophy. For many thinkers, the key to solving philosophical problems lay not in pure speculation about reality, but in carefully examining how we talk about reality. Language, they realized, shapes what we think reality is. Consider something simple. The word cat. When you hear this word, an image might form in your mind. Perhaps you think of a particular cat you know, or perhaps a general cat-like image. But what makes this word mean cat, and not something else? What is the connection between the sound cat and the actual furry animals in the world? Gottlob Frege, whom we encountered earlier in our discussion of logic, was one of the first to explore these questions with precision. In his 1892 paper, On Sense and Reference, Frege made a crucial distinction. Every meaningful expression, he argued, has both a sense, the way it presents or describes something, and a reference, the actual thing it picks out in the world. Consider the phrases the morning star and the evening star. For centuries, people observed a bright star that appeared in the morning sky and another that appeared in the evening sky. They used different names for them. But then astronomers discovered something surprising. These weren't stars at all, and they weren't two different objects. Both phrases referred to the planet Venus. So the morning star and the evening star have the same reference, Venus, but different senses, different ways of presenting that reference. This explains something puzzling. How can the morning star as the evening star be informative, even a discovery, if both phrases refer to the same thing? Because they present that thing differently, describe it from different perspectives. Freya's insight was profound. Meaning isn't just about what words point to in the world. It's also about how they point, about the perspective or mode of presentation they employ. Language doesn't just label things. It describes them, characterizes them, presents them in particular ways. Bertrand Russell took these ideas further in his 1905 paper on denoting. Russell was puzzled by sentences that seem meaningful even though they refer to things that don't exist. Consider, the present king of France is bald. There is no present king of France. So does this sentence refer to nothing? Is it meaningless? Is it false? Or is it somehow neither true nor false? Russell proposed an ingenious solution. Sentences like this should be analyzed into their logical structure. The present king of France is bald really means something like, there exists exactly one thing that is presently king of France, and that thing is bald. Once we translate the sentence into logical form, we can see clearly that it's simply false. There doesn't exist such a thing. The sentence is meaningful but false. Problem solved. This approach, analyzing the logical structure hidden beneath ordinary language, became enormously influential. Russell and others believed that many philosophical confusions arose because the surface grammar of language disguises its true logical form. Philosophy's task was to reveal that hidden structure, to translate ordinary sentences into the precise language of logic. But perhaps the most influential philosopher of language was Ludwig Wittgenstein, and his views changed dramatically over the course of his career. The young Wittgenstein, in his first book Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in 1921, presented a spare, austere vision of language. The world, he argued, consists of facts, configurations of objects. Language consists of propositions, logical pictures of facts. A meaningful sentence pictures a possible state of affairs. If that state of affairs obtains, the sentence is true, if not false. Anything that cannot be pictured in this way, ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, cannot be meaningfully said. It can only be shown, or passed over in silence. It's a beautiful, crystalline vision. Language as a logical mirror of reality. But Wittgenstein himself came to reject it. In his later work, Philosophical Investigations, published posthumously in 1953, Wittgenstein presented a completely different picture. Language, he now argued, isn't primarily about picturing reality. It's about use. Words don't get their meaning by corresponding to things or facts. They get their meaning from how they're used in the countless different activities that make up human life. Think about the word game. What do all games have in common? Chess, football, ring around the rosy, solitaire. What is the essence of gameness that they all share? Wittgenstein suggested there isn't one. Games form a family, connected by overlapping similarities, what he called family resemblances, but with no single feature common to all. And yet we use the word game perfectly well. We know a game when we see one. Language, Wittgenstein suggested, is like a vast city with many neighborhoods, each with its own character, its own rules, its own way of life. He called these language games, different practices of using words, each with its own internal logic. Ordering food at a restaurant is a language game. Telling a joke is a language game. Proving a mathematical theorem is a language game. And there's no single essence uniting them all, just as there's no single essence uniting all games. This means that philosophical problems often arise when we take language out of its natural context, when we try to force words to do jobs they weren't designed for. What is time? Seems like a profound question. But Wittgenstein would ask, in what context are you asking? What practical problem are you trying to solve? If you're trying to catch a train, you know perfectly well what time is. The philosophical confusion arises when we demand a definition that works for all contexts, when we treat time as if it names a mysterious object that needs to be explained. The cure for philosophical confusion, then, isn't more theory. It's careful attention to how words actually function in ordinary life. It's what Wittgenstein called bringing words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. But language doesn't just describe the world. It also acts on the world. This insight was developed by J.L. Austin in his 1962 book, How to Do Things with Words. Austin noticed that many utterances don't simply state facts. They perform actions. When a judge says, "I hereby sentence you to 5 years in prison," she isn't describing a pre-existing fact. She's creating a new social reality through her words. When someone says, "I promise to meet you tomorrow," they're not reporting an inner state. They're making a commitment, entering into an obligation. When a minister says, "I now pronounce you married," those words don't describe a marriage that already exists. They bring the marriage into being. Austin called these performative utterances. Language, he showed, doesn't just represent reality. It helps construct reality, particularly social reality. Laws, contracts, promises, marriages, declarations, warnings, bets, apologies. All of these things are done with words, not just described by them. This opens up a remarkable perspective. We sometimes think of language as a transparent medium, a neutral tool for expressing pre-existing thoughts about a pre-existing world. But perhaps language is more active than that. Perhaps the words we use shape what we can think, what we notice, how we categorize experience. Perhaps different languages carve up reality in different ways, highlighting some distinctions while obscuring others. Consider color. English has separate basic words for blue and green. But some languages use a single term for both, dividing the spectrum at a different point. Do speakers of those languages see color differently? Not in a purely physiological sense, perhaps. But might they categorize their experience differently, notice different similarities, make different distinctions? Or consider time. English grammar forces us to specify tense, past, present, future, in almost every sentence. But some languages handle time differently, placing less emphasis on when something happened and more on other features like evidentiality, how the speaker knows, or aspect, whether an action is completed or ongoing. Does this shape how speakers experience time? It's a fascinating question, one that sits at the intersection of language, thought, and reality. What becomes clear is that language isn't a simple thing. It's not just labels stuck on a pre-existing reality. It's a complex, living practice, embedded in human activities, shaped by history and culture, constantly evolving. Language shapes thought. Thought shapes language. And together, they shape how we experience and construct our world. As you drift now towards sleep, consider the miracle of communication. Somehow, through vibrations in air or marks on a surface, one mind can reach out to another. Thoughts that exist in my consciousness can, through the medium of language, spark corresponding thoughts in yours. It's a kind of telepathy, really imperfect, often misunderstood, but remarkable nonetheless. Every word you know is a key that unlocks a bit of shared meaning. Every sentence you understand is a bridge between minds. Language connects us, allows us to share our inner worlds, to coordinate our actions, to preserve knowledge across generations, to create art and science and culture. And yet language also limits us. Some experiences resist words. Some truths cannot be captured in propositions. Sometimes the most profound things can only be felt, not said. As Wittgenstein famously ended his Tractatus, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." But that silence isn't empty. It's full of everything language cannot contain. Music, the beauty of a sunset, the feeling of love, the taste of strawberries, the quality of consciousness itself. These things can be experienced, can be lived, even if they slip through the net of words. So rest now in the space between language and experience. Rest in the knowledge that some things can be said, and some things must simply be felt. Words have brought you this far. But now, as sleep approaches, let the words dissolve. Let language fade. Let meaning blur into pure experience. And in that wordless space, simply be. We've explored what exists, how we know, how we think, who we are, and how we speak. But now we arrive at perhaps the most urgent question of all. The question that meets us every morning when we wake, and every evening when we reflect on our day. How should we live? This is the domain of ethics, moral philosophy, the study of right and wrong, good and bad, virtue and vice. Ethics doesn't ask what is. It asks what ought to be. It doesn't describe the world as we find it. It evaluates it, judges it, and asks how we might make it better. Ethics is inescapable. Every choice you make carries moral weight, however small. What to eat for breakfast might involve questions of health, environmental impact, animal welfare. How to speak to a stranger involves respect, kindness, honesty. How to spend your time involves questions about what matters, what has value, what kind of person you want to become. We are, each of us, ethical beings. Not necessarily good ethical beings. We all fall short, make mistakes, harm others through action or inaction, but ethical nonetheless. We live in a web of relationships, obligations, possibilities. And we must navigate this web somehow, making choices, shaping our lives, affecting others. But how should we live? What makes an action right or wrong? What makes a life good or bad? Philosophers have offered many different answers, and tonight, as you drift toward rest, we'll explore some of the most enduring approaches. The ancient Greeks asked, "What kind of person should I become?" This question is at the heart of virtue ethics, an approach that focuses not on isolated actions or abstract rules, but on character, on the qualities of a good person, on what the Greeks called arete, excellence or virtue. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, developed this approach most fully. He began with a simple observation: every action aims at some good. We eat to satisfy hunger. We study to gain knowledge. We work to earn money. But what is the ultimate good? What do we seek for its own sake, not as a means to something else? Aristotle's answer, eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but perhaps better understood as flourishing or living well. Eudaimonia is the goal of human life. It's not a fleeting feeling of pleasure, but a state of active excellence, of living in accordance with virtue, of fulfilling your potential as a human being. But what are the virtues? Aristotle listed many: courage, temperance, generosity, magnificence, pride, good temper, friendliness, truthfulness, wit, justice. And he noticed something interesting about them. Each virtue is a mean between two extremes, two vices. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wastefulness. The virtuous person navigates between extremes, finding the right response for each situation. This requires practical wisdom, phronesis, the ability to perceive what each situation calls for. Virtue isn't following rigid rules. It's having the judgment to respond appropriately to the complexity of real life. It's developed through practice, through habit, through education and experience. We become virtuous by doing virtuous acts, just as we become skilled musicians by practicing music. In Plato's Republic, Socrates and his companions explore the nature of justice and ask whether the just person is happier than the unjust person. Plato's answer is that justice is a harmony of the soul, a proper ordering of its parts. The just person has their desires, emotions, and reason working together in balance. And this harmony, this internal order, is its own reward. The virtuous life is the happy life, not because virtue leads to happiness, but because virtue is a kind of happiness. For centuries, virtue ethics was the dominant approach. But in the modern era, new theories emerged that focused less on character and more on action. What makes an act right or wrong? Two major theories competed for dominance. The first is utilitarianism, the view that actions should be judged by their consequences. The right action is the one that produces the most good, the most happiness, the most well-being for the most people. Jeremy Bentham, writing in late 18th century England, formulated this principle clearly. The greatest happiness for the greatest number. Bentham was a social reformer, appalled by the cruelty and inefficiency of the legal and political systems of his time. He wanted a clear, rational basis for reform, and utilitarianism provided it. Don't appeal to tradition, divine command, or intuition. Just ask, will this policy increase or decrease human happiness? Measure the consequences. Choose the action that maximizes well-being. Bentham even tried to develop a philosophic calculus, a way of measuring pleasure and pain, intensity and duration, to calculate which action produces the most happiness. It's charmingly optimistic, this idea that ethics could be made scientific, mathematical. Though in practice, of course, calculating consequences is far more difficult than Bentham imagined. John Stuart Mill refined utilitarianism in important ways. In his short book Utilitarianism, Mill argued that not all pleasures are equal. There are higher and lower pleasures. The pleasures of intellectual and aesthetic experience are qualitatively superior to mere physical pleasures. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Mill tried to rescue utilitarianism from the charge that it reduces ethics to the pursuit of pleasure in the crudest sense. Henry Sidgwick, in his comprehensive work The Methods of Ethics, examined utilitarianism with careful philosophical rigor. He defended it as the most rational ethical theory, but also acknowledged its difficulties and tensions with common moral intuitions. In our own time, Peter Singer has applied utilitarian reasoning to contemporary issues: animal welfare, global poverty, effective altruism. If we can prevent suffering at small cost to ourselves, Singer argues, we are obligated to do so. From a utilitarian perspective, the suffering of a child dying of malnutrition halfway around the world matters, just as much as the suffering of a child next door. Distance doesn't diminish moral obligation. Utilitarianism has tremendous appeal. It's egalitarian. Everyone's happiness counts equally. It's practical, focused on real consequences, real suffering, real flourishing. But it also faces serious objections. What if maximizing overall happiness requires sacrificing an innocent person? What if the right action, by utilitarian calculation, violates our deepest sense of justice or fairness? What about rights, dignity, the intrinsic value of persons? These concerns lead to the second major modern approach, deontology, from the Greek deon, meaning duty. Deontological ethics holds that some actions are right or wrong in themselves, regardless of consequences. There are duties we must follow, rules we must respect, constraints on how we may treat others. The greatest deontological philosopher was Immanuel Kant. In his groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant asked, what could be the basis of morality? Not happiness, certainly. Our ideas of happiness differ too much. Not consequences. These are uncertain and outside our control. Morality must be grounded in something unconditional, something that applies universally to all rational beings. Kant's answer: the moral law is grounded in rationality itself. A rational being recognizes certain principles as binding simply by virtue of being rational. And the fundamental principle, what Kant called the categorical imperative, can be formulated in several ways. The first formulation: act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, before you act, ask, what if everyone did this? Could you consistently will that your principle of action become a universal law? Consider lying. Can you will that everyone should lie whenever convenient? No, because lying only works if most people tell the truth. If everyone lied constantly, the practice of communication itself would break down. Lying is self-contradictory when universalized. Therefore, it's wrong. The second formulation is perhaps even more powerful. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. Never treat people merely as tools for your purposes. Respect their rationality, their autonomy, their dignity as persons. This doesn't mean you can never use people. We use each other all the time in cooperative activities. But you must always respect their status as ends in themselves, as beings with their own goals, their own dignity, their own unconditional worth. This is the foundation of human rights, of dignity, of the idea that persons have an absolute value that cannot be traded off for social utility. It's a powerful, inspiring vision. We matter not because we're useful, not because we contribute to general happiness, but simply because we are rational beings capable of self-governance. W.D. Ross, in his book The Right and the Good, developed a different kind of deontological ethics based on plural duties. Duties of fidelity, reparation, gratitude, justice, beneficence, self-improvement, and non-maleficence. These duties can sometimes conflict, Ross acknowledged, and we must use judgment to determine which duty is most stringent in a particular situation. It's a less systematic approach than Kant's, but perhaps more realistic about moral complexity. Contemporary philosophers like Christine Korsgaard have continued to develop and defend Kantian ethics, exploring how moral obligation arises from our nature as self-reflective, rational agents who must act under the idea of freedom. So we have three major approaches. Virtue ethics asks, who should I become? Utilitarianism asks, what consequences should I produce? Deontology asks, what duties must I respect? Each captures something important. Each faces difficulties. And philosophical debate continues about which, if any, is correct. But ethics extends beyond questions of right action. There's also the question of value itself, particularly aesthetic value. What is beauty? What makes something art? Why do we care about music, painting, poetry, drama? This is the domain of aesthetics, the philosophy of art and beauty. It's a field that's sometimes treated as peripheral to serious philosophy. But aesthetics addresses profound questions about what matters in human life, about sources of meaning beyond moral duty or practical success. Plato, in his dialogue Ion and in parts of the Republic, was deeply suspicious of art. Poetry and painting, he argued, are mere imitations of imitations, copies of physical things, which are themselves copies of eternal forms. Art appeals to emotion rather than reason. It can corrupt, mislead, inflame passions. Plato famously wanted to ban poets from his ideal city. Aristotle, as usual, took a more balanced view. In his Poetics, Aristotle analyzed tragedy, showing how it achieves catharsis, a purification or purging of emotions through pity and fear. Art, for Aristotle, isn't mere imitation. It reveals universal truths, shows us possibilities, helps us understand human nature. A good tragedy is philosophically valuable. Kant, in his Critique of Judgment, explored aesthetic experience with his characteristic rigor. Beauty, Kant argued, is neither purely subjective nor purely objective. When we judge something beautiful, we're not simply reporting a personal preference, nor are we describing an objective property like weight or temperature. Instead, we're making a judgment that we expect others to share, based on a distinctive kind of pleasure, a disinterested pleasure that arises from the free play of our cognitive faculties. Art matters, Kant suggested, because it expands our capacity for experience, stimulates our imagination, reveals aspects of reality that conceptual thought alone cannot capture. In our own time, Arthur Danto explored what makes something art. In The Transfiguration of the Commonplace, Danto asks, "What's the difference between Warhol's Brillo boxes and actual Brillo boxes? They look identical, but one is art, the other isn't. The difference," Danto argues, lies in interpretation, in meaning, in the way the artwork is embedded in a context of art history and theory. Art isn't defined by appearance, but by its place in what Danto calls the art world, a complex network of practices, institutions, and ideas. Beauty, art, aesthetic experience. These enrich life in ways that go beyond moral duty or practical utility. They remind us that we're not merely calculating machines trying to maximize happiness or rational agents following universal laws. We're also creatures who love, create, appreciate, find meaning in forms, colors, sounds, words. Ethics asks how we should live. Aesthetics reminds us of what makes life worth living. As you rest now, consider the ethical dimension of your own life. Not with guilt or anxiety, simply with awareness. You are, whether you plan to be or not, creating a life. Making choices. Shaping your character. Affecting others. Moving through a moral landscape. And the beautiful thing is this. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to choose definitively between virtue ethics, utilitarianism, and deontology. Real moral wisdom often involves drawing on all three, asking what kind of person you want to become, what consequences your actions will have, and what duties and rights must be respected. Live thoughtfully. Act with care. Treat others with respect. Appreciate beauty. Cultivate virtue. Consider consequences. Honor obligations. And through it all, remember that you're human, fallible, limited, but capable of growth, of learning, of becoming better. The ethical life is not about perfection. It's about trying. It's about paying attention. It's about caring enough to ask the question, how should I live? And then doing your best to answer it, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment. We've considered how individuals should live, what makes actions right or wrong, what virtues to cultivate. But humans don't live in isolation. We live together, in families, communities, nations. We create institutions, laws, governments. We exercise power over one another. We cooperate and conflict. We build civilizations and watch them rise and fall. This brings us to political philosophy, the study of justice, rights, authority, and the proper organization of society. If ethics asks, "How should I live?" political philosophy asks, "How should we live together?" These questions have urgency. Politics isn't abstract. It shapes every aspect of our lives: who has power, who has rights, how resources are distributed, who is included and who is excluded, who flourishes and who suffers. Political choices have consequences, sometimes terrible ones. And so we must think carefully about what makes political arrangements just or unjust, legitimate or illegitimate. The conversation begins, as so many do, with Plato. In the Republic, Socrates and his companions set out to understand justice by imagining an ideal city. What would a perfectly just society look like? Plato's answer is striking and, to modern ears, unsettling. Society should be divided into three classes: rulers, philosopher-kings, guardians, warriors, and producers, farmers, craftspeople, merchants. Each class has its role, its virtue. Justice consists in each class doing its proper work, not interfering with others. The philosopher-kings, those rare individuals who have glimpsed the eternal forms, and especially the form of the good, should rule. Not because they seek power, they don't, but because only they truly understand what's good for the city. It's a vision of enlightened authoritarianism, rule by wisdom rather than consent. Plato was skeptical of democracy. He saw it as rule by the ignorant, easily swayed by rhetoric and passion. Better to have those who know guide those who don't. But this raises an obvious question. Who decides who the wise ones are? And what prevents the supposed philosophers from becoming tyrants? Aristotle, in his Politics, took a more empirical approach. He collected and analyzed the constitutions of 158 Greek city-states, looking for patterns. What makes a constitution stable? What leads to revolution? What kinds of government exist? Aristotle distinguished three good forms of government: monarchy, rule by one; aristocracy, rule by the few best; and polity, rule by the many; and three corrupted forms: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Each good form can degenerate into its corrupt version when rulers pursue their own interest rather than the common good. Aristotle's preferred system was a mixed constitution, combining elements of oligarchy and democracy, creating a large middle class with political power. Stability comes from moderation, from balance, from preventing any single group from dominating. But the Greek city-state was small, intimate. Political philosophy needed to adapt to larger scales, to empires and kingdoms, and eventually to modern nation-states. And it needed to answer a fundamental question: what makes political authority legitimate? Why should anyone obey a government? The answer that emerged in 17th century Europe was social contract theory. The idea that legitimate government rests on an agreement, implicit or explicit, among the people. Thomas Hobbes, writing during the English Civil War, painted a dark picture of human nature in his masterwork Leviathan. In the state of nature, before government exists, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Without authority to enforce rules, everyone is at war with everyone else, driven by competition, fear, and the pursuit of glory. No security, no property, no civilization. Just endless conflict. To escape this nightmare, rational individuals agree to surrender their natural liberty to a sovereign, whether a monarch or an assembly, who has absolute power to maintain order. The sovereign isn't party to the contract. It's created by the contract. And once established, the sovereign's authority is absolute. Rebellion is never justified, because it would return everyone to the state of nature. It's a bleak, authoritarian vision. But Hobbes was responding to civil war, to the chaos that results when political authority breaks down. His message: almost any government is better than none. Order is the prerequisite for everything else. John Locke, writing a generation later, offered a very different social contract. In Locke's second treatise of government, the state of nature isn't a war of all against all. People have natural rights to life, liberty, and property, even before government exists. These rights come from natural law, from reason, perhaps from God. But the state of nature has inconveniences. Disputes arise. Who enforces rights? Who punishes wrongdoing? People therefore agree to form a government, ceding some of their natural liberty in exchange for protection of their rights. Crucially, for Locke, the government's authority is limited. It exists to protect rights, not to grant them. If government violates rights systematically, if it becomes tyrannical, the people have a right to resist, to dissolve the government and form a new one. Locke was justifying the English Revolution of 1688, but his ideas would echo in the American and French revolutions. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his Social Contract, offered yet another vision. Rousseau's state of nature was idyllic. Humans were naturally good, compassionate, free. But as societies developed, inequality emerged. Property arose. Some accumulated wealth and power, while others fell into dependence and servitude. Civilization corrupted natural goodness. How to reconcile freedom with social living? Rousseau's answer: through a social contract in which each person alienates all their rights to the community, and in return receives them back as a citizen. The community, acting through the general will, makes laws that apply equally to all. In obeying laws you've participated in making, you remain free. You obey only yourself. It's a beautiful idea, but troubling in practice. What if you disagree with the general will? Rousseau's famous, or infamous, answer: you can be forced to be free. The seeds of both democratic participation and totalitarian control lie in Rousseau's thought. These social contract theories shaped modern political philosophy. But in the 20th century, John Rawls revived contract theory with new sophistication in his A Theory of Justice. Rawls asked, what principles of justice would rational people choose if they didn't know what position they'd occupy in society? Imagine you're behind a veil of ignorance. You don't know if you'll be rich or poor, talented or disabled, majority or minority. What principles would you choose to govern society? Rawls argued you'd choose two principles. First, maximum equal liberty for all. Second, inequalities are permissible only if they benefit the worst off, the difference principle. And opportunities are genuinely open to all. This is a powerful egalitarian vision. Justice requires not just formal equality, but attention to the least advantaged. Society should be arranged to maximize the position of those at the bottom. Robert Nozick, in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, offered a libertarian response. Nozick argued that justice consists in respecting rights, particularly property rights. If you acquire something justly, through labor, trade, or gift, it's yours. Redistributive taxation is a form of forced labor, violating your rights. The only legitimate state is a minimal night watchman state that protects against force and fraud, but does nothing more. The debate between Rawls and Nozick captures a fundamental tension in political philosophy, between equality and liberty, between collective responsibility and individual rights, between seeing society as cooperative enterprise and seeing it as framework for individual action. But political philosophy doesn't just ask about ideal principles. It also examines power, history, the forces that shape societies across time. The philosophy of history asks, does history have a direction, a purpose, a pattern? Or is it just one damn thing after another? As someone once said, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel offered a grand vision of history as the progressive realization of freedom. History, for Hegel, is the self-development of spirit, Geist, becoming conscious of itself. Each civilization represents a stage in this development. Ancient Oriental despotism represented freedom for one, the despot. Greek and Roman civilization represented freedom for some, citizens. Modern European civilization represents freedom for all, in principle at least. History moves through contradiction and conflict. Hegel's famous dialectic. Each stage, thesis, generates its opposite, antithesis, and from their conflict emerges a higher synthesis that preserves what was valuable in both while transcending their limitations. Progress isn't linear but dialectical, through conflict to higher unity. It's an intoxicating vision, grand and optimistic, but also dangerous. If history has a direction, an inevitable telos, does that justify present suffering as necessary for future progress? Karl Marx adopted Hegel's dialectical method, but turned it right side up. For Marx, history isn't driven by the development of spirit, but by material conditions, by economic relations, by class struggle. In the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx outlined historical materialism. The economic base, relations of production, shapes the ideological superstructure, law, politics, culture. History moves through stages: primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and ultimately Marx predicted communism. Each system contains contradictions that eventually lead to its overthrow. Capitalism creates enormous productivity, but also exploitation, alienation, and class conflict. Eventually, the working class will overthrow capitalism and create a classless society. Marx's vision has been enormously influential and enormously controversial. Is history really driven by economics? Is class struggle the motor of change? Are Marx's predictions accurate? The 20th century attempted to answer these questions, often with terrible consequences. R.G. Collingwood, in The Idea of History, took a different approach. History isn't about discovering laws like those in natural science. It's about understanding the thoughts and intentions of historical actors. The historian must rethink past thoughts, imaginatively reconstruct the perspectives of people in different times and places. History is interpretive, not merely factual. This raises profound questions. Can we truly understand people from radically different cultures? Is historical knowledge objective? Or is it always shaped by the historian's own perspective, prejudices, present concerns? These questions are central to critical theory, an approach that examines how power operates through ideology, how domination is maintained not just through force, but through shaping consciousness, controlling discourse, defining what counts as rational or normal. The Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and others, fled Nazi Germany and developed a sophisticated critique of modern society. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno argued that the Enlightenment project of rational mastery over nature had become a new form of domination. Instrumental reason, treating everything as means to an end, had colonized all aspects of life. Even culture had become an industry, mass-producing conformity. The result, a society that appears rational, free, democratic, but actually maintains subtle forms of control. People are manipulated by advertising, entertainment, ideology. They think they're choosing freely, but their desires and beliefs are shaped by forces they don't recognize. Jürgen Habermas, in the theory of communicative action, tried to rescue the Enlightenment project. Habermas distinguished instrumental reason, means-end efficiency, from communicative reason, mutual understanding through dialogue. Emancipation comes not from abandoning reason, but from creating conditions for genuine communication, free from domination and distortion. What emerges from all this is a recognition. Power operates in complex ways, not just through force, but through ideas, institutions, language. Justice requires not just good laws, but attention to subtle forms of domination. Political philosophy must examine not just ideal principles, but actual practices, historical forces, structures of power. As you rest now, consider the political dimension of existence. You are not just an individual making personal choices. You are a citizen, a member of communities, embedded in systems of power and justice and history. Your life is shaped by political forces, and you help shape them in turn, however small your influence may seem. The quest for justice continues. Societies rise and fall. Power shifts. New forms of domination emerge. New possibilities for freedom arise. And through it all, people ask, how should we live together? What do we owe each other? What makes authority legitimate? What does justice require? These questions have no final answers. But asking them, thinking about them, struggling with them. This is part of what it means to be human, to be political animals, as Aristotle said, creatures who live together and must figure out how to do so justly. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of this long conversation, this ongoing struggle for justice. You don't need to solve it all tonight. Just hold the questions gently as you drift towards sleep. How should we live together? The question echoes through history and awaits tomorrow's answers. We've built systems of thought. Logic, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, political philosophy, grand structures of reason, carefully constructed over centuries. But now something shifts. Philosophy begins to turn against itself, to question its own foundations, to rebel against the very idea of systematic thought. This is the story of philosophy in crisis, of thinkers who looked at the elaborate edifices of traditional philosophy and said, "We've lost something. We've left out what matters most. We need to start over." The rebellion begins quietly, with a simple question. What if we've been approaching philosophy wrong all along? What if, instead of constructing theories about reality, we should first examine experience itself? The raw, lived experience that comes before all theory, all concepts, all systems. This is the insight at the heart of phenomenology, a philosophical movement that says, let's set aside our assumptions, our theories, our prejudices, and simply describe what appears to consciousness exactly as it appears. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, wanted philosophy to become a rigorous science, but not a science like physics or biology, a science of consciousness, of experience, of the structures that make experience possible. In his work Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology, Husserl described a method he called epike, a Greek word meaning suspension. Suspend judgment about whether the external world exists. Suspend your scientific theories, your common-sense beliefs. Just attend to the phenomena, to what shows up in consciousness. What you discover, Husserl argued, is that consciousness is always intentional, always directed toward something. You're never just conscious, you're conscious of something. Seeing is always seeing something. Thinking is always thinking about something. Consciousness reaches out toward objects, constitutes them, gives them meaning. Phenomenology asks, how does a mere sensation become a perceived object? How does consciousness construct a unified world from fragmentary experiences? How do meanings emerge? These aren't questions about brain processes or physical causation. They're questions about the structures of experience itself. But phenomenology took unexpected turns. Martin Heidegger, Husserl's student, radicalized the project. In Being and Time, Heidegger argued that we've forgotten the most fundamental question. What does it mean for something to be? What is being itself? Heidegger claimed that traditional philosophy had obscured this question by treating being as if it were just another entity, just another thing among things. But being isn't a thing. It's the ground, the horizon, the opening within which things can appear at all. To approach being, we must examine Dasein, literally being there, Heidegger's term for human existence. We are the beings who ask about being, who care about our own existence, who exist in time, who face death. Dasein is always thrown into a world not of its choosing, always projecting possibilities, always interpreting, always concerned. Heidegger's prose is notoriously difficult, full of neologisms and dense analysis. But at its heart is something profound. We are not detached observers of reality. We are always already in the world, engaged, involved, interpreting. Understanding isn't primarily theoretical. It's practical, lived, embodied. Maurice Merleau-Ponty pushed phenomenology in yet another direction. In Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty argued that traditional philosophy had ignored the body, treating the mind as pure consciousness separate from physical existence. But we are fundamentally embodied. Our body isn't just an object we possess. It's our way of being in the world, our means of engaging with reality. When you reach for a cup, you don't first calculate distances and angles. Your body knows how to reach, how to grasp. This bodily knowledge is pre-reflective, prior to conscious thought. Perception isn't passive reception of sensory data. It's active engagement with the world through a living body. Merleau-Ponty's descriptions are beautiful, careful, attentive to the texture of lived experience. He shows us how perception is always ambiguous, always partial, always from a perspective. The world reveals itself through our embodied engagement, never all at once, always inviting further exploration. Phenomenology, then, is a rebellion against abstraction, against losing touch with concrete experience. It says, before you theorize, describe. Before you explain, attend. Philosophy must return to the things themselves, to experience as it's actually lived. But another rebellion was brewing, more dramatic, more anguished. This was existentialism, a philosophy born of crisis, of confrontation with meaninglessness, of radical freedom and terrible responsibility. The roots go back to Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher writing in the mid-19th century. Kierkegaard rejected the grand systematic philosophy of Hegel, that confident march of reason through history. Life isn't a logical system, Kierkegaard insisted. It's paradox, passion, subjective struggle. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard examined the story of Abraham and Isaac. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son. Abraham obeys, and at the last moment, God provides a ram instead. But what kind of God demands such a thing? How can faith require suspending ethics, the most fundamental moral law against murder? Kierkegaard called Abraham a knight of faith, someone who makes a teleological suspension of the ethical, who acts on a higher calling that defies rational comprehension. It's absurd, paradoxical, agonizing. And that's precisely the nature of faith. It's not comfortable certainty. It's a leap into the unknown, a passionate commitment despite uncertainty. Friedrich Nietzsche pushed the crisis further. God is dead, Nietzsche proclaimed. Not that there was a God who died, but that the idea of God, the foundation of Western morality and meaning, had lost its power. And with God's death comes nihilism, the recognition that there are no absolute values, no cosmic purpose, no inherent meaning. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's prophet descends from the mountain to announce this terrible news and to proclaim a new vision. The Übermensch, the overhuman, the one who creates their own values, who affirms life despite its suffering, who says yes to existence in all its chaos and cruelty. Nietzsche wasn't counseling despair. He was calling for a radical revaluation of values, a courage to live authentically without the comforting illusions of religion or metaphysics. Life has no given meaning. Therefore, create meaning. Embrace your power, your will, your creativity. In the 20th century, existentialism became a movement, particularly in France. Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, developed a systematic phenomenological ontology around a stark claim. Existence precedes essence. There is no human nature, no blueprint, no predetermined purpose. We simply exist, and then we choose what we will become. This is radical freedom, and it's terrifying. You are responsible for your choices, your values, your identity. You cannot blame circumstances, God, nature, or society. In Sartre's famous phrase, we are condemned to be free. In his lecture Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre tried to show that existentialism isn't a counsel of despair, but a demanding ethics. If we create our values through our choices, then we must choose as if we were choosing for all humanity. Every action is a statement about what we think human beings should be. But we constantly flee from this freedom through bad faith, self-deception, pretending we have no choice, hiding behind roles and social expectations. The waiter who over-identifies with being a waiter, the woman who pretends her companion's advances just happened to her. These are examples of bad faith, of denying one's freedom and responsibility. Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre's partner and a profound philosopher in her own right, applied existentialist thinking to gender in The Second Sex. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman, de Beauvoir famously wrote. Gender isn't biological destiny. It's a social construction, a set of constraints and expectations that limit women's freedom, defining them as other in relation to man as subject. De Beauvoir's analysis is existentialist. We are free, but our freedom is situated, constrained by history and society. Liberation requires recognizing these constraints and choosing to transcend them, to create new possibilities for what it means to be human. Existentialism, then, confronts us with radical freedom, with the absence of cosmic meaning, with the necessity of creating our own values in an indifferent universe. Its philosophy is lived crisis, as personal struggle, as authenticity versus self-deception. But there's yet another rebellion, perhaps the most radical of all. What if not just traditional philosophy, but language itself is unstable, unreliable, full of contradictions and undecidability? This is the insight of deconstruction, an approach developed by Jacques Derrida that analyzes texts and concepts to reveal their internal tensions, their dependence on what they exclude, their inability to establish stable meaning. Derrida wasn't simply saying that language is ambiguous or that communication is imperfect. He was making a more radical claim. Western philosophy has always privileged presence, immediate, unmediated access to meaning, truth, consciousness. Speech over writing, substance over sign, identity over difference. But this privileging is unstable. In his book of Grammatology, Derrida showed how the very concepts that philosophy relies on, presence, identity, truth, depend on difference, absence, the play of signs. Meaning is never fully present. It's always deferred, always referring to other meanings, always caught up in chains of signification. Consider the concept of nature. It's defined against culture. But where exactly is the boundary? Humans are part of nature, yet we create culture. Is language natural or cultural? The distinction seems clear until you examine it closely, and then it begins to blur, to deconstruct itself. Or consider speech and writing. Philosophy has traditionally privileged speech as more authentic, more direct. Writing is seen as a secondary representation of speech, which is itself a representation of thought. But Derrida argued that speech already has the characteristics we attribute to writing. It's mediated, absent from itself, caught up in systems of difference. In his essay Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, Derrida argued that there is no transcendental signified, no ultimate meaning outside the play of language that grounds all other meanings. Every attempt to establish a foundation simply invokes other signs, other concepts, in an endless chain. This seems vertiginous, relativistic, nihilistic. And critics have accused deconstruction of undermining truth, of making rigorous thought impossible. But Derrida insisted he wasn't denying truth or meaning. He was showing their complexity, their instability, the way they resist the simple presence that philosophy has always sought. Deconstruction has been enormously influential and enormously controversial. It spread through literary theory, cultural studies, legal theory, feminist theory. It's been accused of everything from irresponsible playfulness to dangerous relativism. But it represents a genuine philosophical insight. Meaning is more unstable, more complex, more slippery than we'd like to admit. So here we are. Phenomenology says, return to experience. Existentialism says, confront meaninglessness and create your own meaning. Deconstruction says, even language and meaning are unstable, always already undermining themselves. These movements share a sense of crisis, a rebellion against the calm certainties of traditional systematic philosophy. They're responding to the traumas of the 20th century, world wars, totalitarianism, genocide, the collapse of old certainties. Philosophy couldn't remain in its ivory tower, calmly constructing logical systems. It had to grapple with concrete existence, with suffering, with the fragility of meaning itself. As you rest now, don't be troubled by this crisis. The instability these philosophers describe isn't chaos. It's the texture of actual human existence, ambiguous, open-ended, unfinished. We live without absolute foundations, without cosmic guarantees, without final answers. And yet we live, we choose, we create meaning, we love, we struggle, we find joy. The rebellion against systems isn't a rejection of thought. It's a deepening of thought, a recognition that reality is richer and stranger than any system can capture. The questions remain open. The search continues. And in that openness, in that search, there is a kind of freedom. Experience before theory. Existence before essence. Questions before answers. Let these thoughts drift now. Let them settle. Let them dissolve into the quiet of approaching sleep. The crisis isn't something to solve tonight. It's something to live with, to live through, to find your way within. And somehow, that's enough. We've journeyed through Western philosophy, from ancient Greece through medieval Europe, through the Enlightenment and into modernity. We've encountered metaphysics and epistemology, ethics and politics, phenomenology and existentialism. But now, as our journey draws toward its close, we must widen our lens. We must remember that philosophy isn't solely a Western enterprise. Across the world, in different times and places, humans have asked the deepest questions and offered profoundly different answers. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, let's open ourselves to other voices, other traditions, other ways of understanding reality. Not to judge them, not to compare them competitively, but simply to listen, to learn, to expand our sense of what philosophical wisdom can be. Let us turn eastward, to China, where a very different philosophical conversation began roughly the same time as the Greek philosophers were asking their questions. But the concerns were different. The questions were different. And the answers, remarkably different. Confucianism emerged in a time of chaos during China's Warring States period. Confucius, or Kongfuzi, Master Kong, lived in the 5th century BCE. He was a teacher, a scholar, deeply concerned with how society could be restored to harmony after generations of conflict and disorder. His answer wasn't metaphysical speculation or logical analysis. It was something more practical, more human-centered. The way to create a good society is to cultivate good people. And good people are those who embody certain fundamental virtues. The most important virtue is ren, often translated as humaneness, benevolence, or compassion. It's the feeling of care for others, of empathy, of recognizing your fundamental connection to other human beings. A person of ren cannot bear to see others suffer. They naturally extend kindness, consideration, respect. But ren must be expressed through li. Ritual propriety, the proper forms of conduct. This isn't empty formalism. Li includes all the ways we show respect, maintain relationships, honor what deserves honor. How you greet someone, how you sit at a meal, how you conduct a funeral. These rituals aren't arbitrary. They embody and express moral relationships. The Analects, the collected sayings of Confucius, present a vision of the ethical life as a constant process of self-cultivation. You don't simply follow rules. You work to become a certain kind of person, a junzi, an exemplary person, someone of moral refinement. This happens through study, learning from classical texts, from history, from poetry, through observation, watching how virtuous people behave, through practice, gradually internalizing proper conduct until it becomes second nature. Virtue isn't something you're born with or acquire all at once. It's a lifelong project of growth and refinement. Mencius, developing Confucian thought, argued that human nature is fundamentally good. We all have innate moral tendencies. Compassion when we see a child about to fall into a well, shame when we do wrong, respect for what deserves respect. These sprouts of virtue need to be cultivated, like plants that need watering and sunlight. Society's task is to create conditions where these natural goodness can flourish. Xuanzi, by contrast, argued that human nature is originally selfish and chaotic. Virtue must be instilled through education, through ritual, through the deliberate shaping of character. Without cultivation, we revert to disorder. In later centuries, Neo-Confucians like Zhu Xi developed a sophisticated metaphysics to ground Confucian ethics. They spoke of li, not ritual propriety this time, but principle, the rational pattern that structures reality, and qi, material force or vital energy. Everything combines principle and matter. Understanding principle, especially the principle of human nature, becomes key to self-cultivation. But Confucianism wasn't the only philosophical voice in ancient China. Another tradition emerged, more mysterious, more paradoxical, questioning the very premises of Confucian thought. This was Taoism, the philosophy of the way, the Tao. If Confucianism emphasized social order, ritual, cultivation, Taoism pointed toward something more natural, more spontaneous, more flowing. The Daedejing, attributed to the legendary Laozi, opens with a paradox. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Language, concepts, categories, these carve up reality, imposing artificial boundaries on what is fundamentally whole and undifferentiated. The Tao is the source of everything, the pattern underlying all change, the way things naturally are when not distorted by human interference. It cannot be grasped conceptually. It can only be lived, aligned with, moved by. The key is wu-wei, non-forcing, non-striving, acting without action. This doesn't mean passivity or laziness. It means acting in harmony with the natural flow of things, not imposing your will, not struggling against reality. Like water, which is soft and yielding yet carves through stone. Like a skilled craftsman whose tools move effortlessly, almost by themselves, because they've aligned with the material's natural grain. Taoism offers a different way of being in the world. Not striving for achievement, but embracing simplicity. Not accumulating knowledge, but unlearning. Not controlling, but flowing. It's a philosophy of letting go, of trust in the natural course of things. Now let us travel further, to ancient India, where yet another profound tradition emerged around the same time as Greek and Chinese philosophy. This was Buddhist philosophy, born from the insights of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the awakened one. The Buddha's teaching begins with a stark diagnosis. Dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, the unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence. We suffer because we cling to pleasures that fade, to relationships that change, to a self that doesn't exist in the way we think it does. Everything is impermanent, anicca. Nothing stays the same. Your body ages, your thoughts come and go, civilizations rise and fall. Clinging to permanence in a world of constant change inevitably brings suffering. And there is no permanent self, anatta non-self. When you look carefully at your experience, you find sensations, thoughts, emotions, perceptions, but no unchanging I that has these experiences. The sense of self is a construct, a convenient fiction, not an ultimate reality. But the Buddha wasn't preaching despair. He was offering a path to liberation, the noble eightfold path of right understanding, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Through meditation and ethical practice, one can see through the illusion of self, let go of clinging, and attain nirvana, the cessation of suffering, not through annihilation, but through profound realization. Buddhist philosophy developed in extraordinarily sophisticated directions. The Abhidharma tradition analyzed experience into its most basic components, creating detailed taxonomies of mental states and processes. Nagarjuna developed Madhyamaka philosophy, showing through rigorous logic that all concepts, when examined carefully, lack inherent existence. They're empty of independent reality. Even emptiness itself is empty. Yogacara philosophy explored consciousness and perception, arguing that we never directly experience external objects, only mental representations. Perhaps some Yogacara thinkers suggested there is only consciousness, only mind, and what we call the external world is a projection. Zen Buddhism, which flowered in China and Japan, emphasized direct experience over intellectual understanding. Koans, paradoxical questions like, what is the sound of one hand clapping, are designed to exhaust conceptual thinking and provoke sudden insight beyond words. But India was home to other profound philosophical traditions. Vedanta, based on the ancient Upanishads, explored the relationship between ultimate reality and individual consciousness. The Upanishads declare, Tattvam-asi, that thou art. The ultimate reality, Brahman, and your deepest self, Atman, are not separate. When you truly know yourself, you discover you are not this limited, changing person, but pure consciousness, eternal, infinite, identical with the ground of all being. Different Vedanta schools interpreted this differently. Akaras Advaita Vedanta taught radical non-dualism. Only Brahman truly exists. The world of multiplicity is Maya, illusion or appearance. Liberation comes through realizing your identity with Brahman, through seeing through the illusion of separateness. Ramanuja Svidvaitota qualified non-dualism. agreed that Atman and Brahman are ultimately united, but maintained that individual souls and the world are real, existing as modes or qualities of Brahman. God is not simply impersonal consciousness, but a personal deity deserving devotion. Madhvaita philosophy went further, teaching dualism. Souls and God remain eternally distinct. Liberation isn't absorption into the divine, but eternal loving relationship with God. The Bhagavad Gita, perhaps India's most beloved philosophical text, weaves together multiple paths: the yoga of knowledge, the yoga of action, and the yoga of devotion, showing how each can lead to liberation. Now let us turn westward again, but to a different tradition, Islamic philosophy, which flourished from the 9th century onward, preserving and extending Greek philosophy while developing its own distinctive concerns. Islamic philosophers faced a unique challenge: how to reconcile rational philosophy, particularly Aristotelian and Neoplatonic thought, with revealed religion, with the Quran and Islamic theology. Al-Farabi, sometimes called the second teacher, after Aristotle, envisioned the ideal state as one led by a philosopher-prophet who combines intellectual wisdom with divine revelation. He developed sophisticated theories of logic, metaphysics, and emanation, how multiplicity flows from divine unity. Avicenna, Ibn Sina, was perhaps the greatest of Islamic philosophers. His Book of Healing is an encyclopedic work covering logic, physics, mathematics, metaphysics, and psychology. Avicenna distinguished between essence and existence, argued for the necessary existence of God, and developed a theory of the soul as an immaterial substance that survives bodily death. His famous flying man thought experiment asked, imagine you're created floating in air, with no sensory input. Would you still be aware of yourself? Avicenna argued yes, showing that self-awareness doesn't depend on the body. Averroes, Ibn Rushd, defended philosophy against theological critics. He wrote detailed commentaries on Aristotle that would profoundly influence medieval Christian philosophy. Averroes argued that philosophy and religion are compatible. They simply express truth in different ways: philosophical demonstration for the educated, religious imagery for everyone else. But Al-Ghazali, in The Incoherence of the Philosophers, mounted a powerful critique, arguing that philosophers had overstepped their bounds, claiming rational knowledge of matters that can only be known through revelation. His work shaped Islamic thought's relationship with philosophy for centuries. As you rest now, consider the breadth of human wisdom. From China to India, from Greece to Persia, humans have wondered, questioned, sought understanding. And they've found different answers, emphasized different values, developed different practices. Confucianism's emphasis on social harmony and moral cultivation. Taoism's embrace of spontaneity and naturalness. Buddhism's analysis of suffering and path to liberation. Vedanta's non-dualism and vision of unity. Islamic philosophy's integration of reason and revelation. These aren't just intellectual curiosities. They're lived traditions, ways of being in the world, practiced by billions across centuries. Each offers insights, each has wisdom to share. You don't need to choose between them. You don't need to master them all. Just hold them gently in your awareness. Remember that philosophy is a human enterprise, that wisdom has many voices, that truth reveals itself in different ways to different peoples. The questions remain: what is real? How should we live? What matters most? But the answers vary beautifully, richly, across cultures and times. And in that variety, there's a kind of humility, a recognition that no single tradition captures all truth, that we have much to learn from each other, that wisdom is larger than any one perspective. So rest now in this expanded vision. Rest in the knowledge that you're part of a global, ancient conversation. Rest in the beauty of human seeking, human wondering, human wisdom in all its diverse forms. The journey continues. The questions remain open. And across the world, in every tradition, people still ask, still wonder, still seek. What is real? How should we live? What, in the end, truly matters? Let these questions fade now into sleep, knowing that tomorrow, the seeking continues, in all its beautiful, diverse human forms. And so, we've come full circle. We began by asking the simplest and most profound question. What is reality? We've traveled through metaphysics and epistemology, through logic and philosophy of mind, through ethics and politics, through phenomenology and existentialism. We've heard voices from ancient Greece and medieval Europe, from Enlightenment France and modern America. We've listened to the wisdom of Confucius and Laozi, the Buddha and Akra, Islamic philosophers bridging East and West. And what have we discovered? Not answers exactly. Or rather, too many answers. Beautiful, conflicting, illuminating answers. Plato said reality is eternal forms. Aristotle said reality is substance and form united in things. Descartes said reality is two kinds of substance, mind and matter. Berkeley said reality is ideas in minds. Hume said we cannot know. Kant said reality in itself is unknowable. We know only appearances structured by our minds. Contemporary metaphysicians debate whether numbers exist, whether possible worlds are real, whether time flows or is an illusion. The rationalists trusted reason. The empiricists trusted experience. The skeptics trusted neither. And here we are, still wondering how we can know anything at all. Some philosophers said the self is an immortal soul. Others said it's a bundle of perceptions with no underlying unity. Still others said it's constructed through social relations, or that it's an illusion to be seen through, or that existence precedes essence, and we create ourselves through our choices. For ethics, some emphasized character and virtue. Others focused on consequences and happiness. Still others insisted on duties and rights. And they couldn't all be entirely right, could they? Different cultures approached these questions from different starting points, with different assumptions, different values, different practices. What seemed obviously true in one tradition was questioned, or reversed in another. So here's the question that emerges as you drift towards sleep. If reality, knowledge, self, and value can be understood so differently, what does that mean for how we live today? Does it mean that truth is relative, that nothing really matters, that philosophy is just word games with no real answers? Some have drawn that conclusion. But perhaps the lesson is different. Perhaps more interesting. Perhaps more freeing. Consider this. Every philosophical tradition we've explored emerged from genuine human wonder, from careful observation, from rigorous thinking. None of them was arbitrary or foolish. Each captured something real, something important, even if none captured everything. Plato saw something true about universals, about how we recognize justice or beauty across different instances. Aristotle saw something true about how form and matter are inseparable in concrete things. Hume saw something true about the limits of what reason alone can establish. Kant saw something true about how our minds actively structure experience. The virtue ethicists were right that character matters, that we become what we repeatedly do. The utilitarians were right that consequences matter, that suffering and flourishing are morally relevant. The deontologists were right that rights and dignity matter, that people aren't just means to ends. The phenomenologists were right that we need to attend carefully to lived experience. The existentialists were right that we face radical freedom and responsibility. The deconstructionists were right that meaning is more complex and unstable than it seems. Confucians were right about the importance of social harmony and moral cultivation. Taoists were right about flowing with nature rather than forcing. Buddhists were right about suffering and impermanence. Vedantins were right about the mysterious depth of consciousness. Islamic philosophers were right about integrating reason and faith. They're not all wrong. They're all partially right. Each tradition illuminates reality from a particular angle, highlights certain features while obscuring others. Like people examining an elephant in a dark room, one touching the trunk, another the leg, another the ear. Each reports accurately what they've encountered, even though their descriptions seem contradictory. So what does this mean for how you live? First, perhaps humility. Intellectual humility. The recognition that your understanding is partial, that your perspective is limited, that certainty is rarer than you think. This doesn't mean abandoning all beliefs. It means holding them more lightly, remaining open to correction, listening to different voices. Second, appreciation for complexity. Reality is not simple. Ethics is not simple. Human experience is not simple. Anyone who offers you simple answers to complex questions is probably selling something. The world reveals itself in paradoxes, in tensions, in multiple valid perspectives that must somehow be held together. Third, responsibility. If there's no cosmic guarantee of meaning, no absolute foundation for values, no predetermined purpose, then we bear responsibility for creating meaning, for choosing values, for shaping our lives and our world. This is what the existentialists saw clearly. Freedom is terrifying, but also beautiful. You are not simply following a script. You are in part writing it. Fourth, compassion. If everyone is struggling with the same fundamental mysteries, if everyone is trying to make sense of existence with limited knowledge and understanding, if everyone is fumbling toward truth in the darkness, then perhaps we can be gentler with each other. Disagreement doesn't require contempt. Different perspectives aren't threats. They're opportunities to see more fully. Fifth, wonder. Never lose the capacity to be amazed. That there is something rather than nothing. That you are conscious, aware, experiencing this moment. That reality reveals itself as beautiful, terrible, mysterious, overwhelming. Philosophy begins in wonder, Plato said, and it should never lose it. You don't need to choose one philosophical system and reject all others. You can learn from multiple traditions, draw on different insights for different situations, hold tensions rather than resolving them prematurely. Real wisdom often lies in paradox, in both and rather than either-or. Be like the Confucian in cultivating virtue and maintaining relationships. Be like the Taoist in going with the flow and not forcing. Be like the Buddhist in recognizing impermanence and letting go of clinging. Be like the virtue ethicist in asking who you're becoming. Be like the utilitarian in considering consequences. Be like the Kantian in respecting human dignity. Use logic when it's helpful, but recognize its limits. Trust experience, but know that experience can mislead. Seek knowledge, but acknowledge what you don't know. Construct meaning, but stay open to mystery. This isn't relativism or wishy-washy both-sides-ism. It's recognizing that reality is richer than any single system can capture, that human wisdom has many sources, that truth speaks in many voices. And practically day to day, this means pay attention to your experience, to others, to the world. Think carefully. Examine your assumptions, trace implications, seek understanding. Act with integrity. Align your actions with your values, even when it's difficult. Stay curious. Never assume you have nothing left to learn. Be kind to yourself and others, recognizing our shared vulnerability and confusion. Philosophy doesn't give you a rulebook for life. It gives you tools for thinking, frameworks for understanding, a heritage of wisdom to draw upon. It shows you that the questions matter, that the search matters, that careful thought about how to live is itself a kind of living well. As you drift now into sleep, let all these ideas, all these voices, all these traditions, let them settle like snow falling gently on a winter evening. Each snowflake different, each beautiful, together creating something larger than anyone alone. You've journeyed through thousands of years of human wisdom tonight. From ancient Greece to medieval Baghdad, from Enlightenment Europe to ancient China and India, you've encountered questions that have no final answers and answers that raise new questions. And tomorrow, when you wake, the questions will still be there. What is real? How can we know? Who am I? How should I live? These questions don't go away. They can't be finally solved, but they can be lived with, lived through, lived into. And in the living, in paying attention, thinking carefully, acting with integrity, staying curious, being kind, you participate in the great human conversation that has no ending, only countless new beginnings. The universe is vast and strange. Consciousness is miraculous and mysterious. Existence is gift and burden and wonder all at once. And you are here, briefly, impossibly, experiencing it all. What a strange and beautiful thing. What an unlikely, improbable, precious thing. Philosophy can't tell you what it all means, but it can help you ask better questions, think more clearly, live more deliberately. It can connect you to thousands of years of humans wondering the same things you wonder, struggling with the same mysteries. You are not alone in your questions. You are part of an ancient conversation. And your voice, your wondering, your seeking, they matter. They add to the great ongoing dialogue about what it means to be human, to be conscious, to exist. So rest now. Rest in the questions. Rest in the mystery. Rest in the knowledge that wisdom is a journey, not a destination. That understanding is always partial. That the search itself is valuable, even when answers elude us. Let your mind grow quiet. Let your thoughts slow. Let the day's concerns fade into the background. You've traveled far tonight, through centuries and continents, through ideas and arguments, through questions that have captivated the finest human minds. And now, simply rest. Simply be. Simply exist, without needing to understand everything, without needing to have all the answers. The questions remain. The mystery continues. And you are part of it all. A conscious point in the universe, briefly wondering, briefly seeking, briefly aware. What is reality? Rest now in the question. How can we know? Rest in the mystery. Who am I? Rest in being. How should I live? Rest, and in the morning, you will live your answer. Good night. Sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful, thoughtful, and wise.